The protagonist is a very important character when it comes to storytelling. The role of the protagonist is often to serve as the main point of view for the person watching the story as it unfolds. For Bendy and the Ink Machine, we discovered the realm of the cycle through the eyes of Henry Stein. For Boris in the Dark Survival, we followed Boris the Wolf as he scavenged the labyrinth-like floors in the studio in search of supplies and provisions. The protagonist of any story can help introduce you to the world around them. You can watch how they interact with the environment that they're in, along with how the environment interacts with them in return. With the release of Bendy and the Dark Revival, we were given a brand new perspective in this game's universe with the introduction of our newest protagonist. The protagonist we get to play as in Bendy and the Dark Revival is Audrey, an animator that works for Archgate Studios. The player follows Audrey as she explores the studio in a new light. Through Audrey's perspective, the player can meet new characters, as well as rediscover characters from previous games. This gives Audrey a chance to shed light on her own character, as well as flesh out any and all characters that she interacts with. In addition to all that, we get to learn so much more from this new perspective than we could have learned from the perspectives of Henry and Boris. Because of what we learned in the events of BATIM, I have reason to believe that Audrey has the greatest potential as a character within the franchise. I want to go over Audrey's story in the game, and share my reasons for why Audrey is an amazing character in Bendy and the Dark Revival, as well as my favorite protagonist within the Bendy franchise. Let's begin with the story. The story begins with Audrey sitting at her desk, finishing up one of the hundreds of frames she needs to complete for her upcoming deadline. Considering she's working in the studio after hours, it's understandable to guess that she needs to get it done within the next day or two. Audrey abruptly decides to take a brief trip to the lobby for a glass of coffee. She stands up from her desk, taking a quick mandatory break to observe her ever-flawless reflection in the mirror, and boards the elevator for the lobby. The doors to the elevator are nearly closed before an old man suddenly reaches in, stopping them before they can.
Audrey.
Wilson? You scared me to death.
This man is Wilson, one of the studio's janitors. He asks Audrey if she'd be willing to let him ride the elevator with her, to which she nervously agrees. She tries to lighten the mood with small talk before the elevator abruptly stops on a different floor. This floor leads to the studio's museum for Joey's works and many relics that were brought in from the former studio. Wilson leads Audrey to the back of the museum where she finds an odd-looking machine and 6 pedestals, each pedestal displaying an image of various items. Wilson asks Audrey to fetch the many items displayed on the pedestals, claiming they're supposed to be exhibits for the museum, while he fixes the power in a nearby fuse box. Audrey does a brief scan of the museum and collects all the different items, setting them on each respective pedestal. After gathering the items, Wilson asks Audrey to do one more thing: pull the switch by the door. Audrey pulls the switch. Almost immediately, she turns to find that Wilson has closed the door, locking them both in. The machine suddenly turns on, slowly beginning to flood the room with ink. Wilson turns to face the now very frightened Audrey and gives her a warning.
Come find me, Audrey. Come find me, and I'll show you your purpose. I'll show you the truth.
And with that, Wilson pulls Audrey into the ink. Audrey's muffled screams can be heard from beneath the surface as the scene fades to black.
What are you doing? Oh no. No.
After an uncertain amount of time, Audrey wakes up. She immediately notices that all color is completely gone, only seeing various tones of sepia. Almost everything looks as if it's been drawn in a sketchbook. Audrey rolls onto her back, blocking the light above her with her hands, and she quickly notices that they're completely drenched in ink. There's a brief moment of panic as Audrey fully awakens, further taking in her surroundings. As Audrey explores the strange sepia-toned world, an announcement from Wilson plays over various speakers that hang on the walls. Wilson's announcement is a claim to have defeated a creature called the Ink Demon, noting that 211 days have passed since the creature was last seen. Following his claim, Wilson instructs the many listeners to return the favor with one rather concerning task.
Among you
Going further, Audrey enters a large lobby called Heavenly Toys. Her path is blocked when she's attacked by a deformed monster called a Piper. Audrey is fortunately saved by a woman named Alice, who kindly guides her on day-to-day survival in what is only known as the studio. Audrey is instructed to seek shelter in the upper levels of the studio before Alice quickly departs, but not before giving Audrey one last warning.
Above everything else, stay away from the ink demon.
Audrey continues on her journey, passing by a mirror where she gets a first good glimpse at her body. Her entire body is completely drenched in ink, and her eyes glow in a bright yellow, with her irises completely invisible.
Damn it, she's so fucking pretty! Look at her!
Audrey is once again blocked when she comes across a locked door that leads to a place called Animation Alley. She contacts Alice through a speaker system, who quickly instructs her to find the gent pipe to break through the lock. It takes a little while, and then break through said locked door. Almost immediately after breaking through the locked door, Audrey passes through a partially ink-flooded room, and in this room, Audrey suddenly starts to feel incredibly dizzy, and even has to lean against the wall to prevent herself from falling. Also, just a fun fact, if you listen carefully in this cutscene, you can hear the faint noises of a baby crying. It's easier to hear it if you turn down the music and effects in the audio settings. And another fun fact, I'm the one who actually found this little clip, and I am so proud of it to this very day. I know this little fun fact is out of nowhere, but trust me, it becomes very important later on. Shortly after nearly passing out in the ink, Audrey suddenly receives the gift that the voices mentioned earlier. The ability to banish others. This ability is marked with a rather disturbing sigil that manifests on her left hand. Traveling a little further, Audrey eventually comes across a massive hole in the floor which should most definitely not be there. With no way to cross over it, Audrey has to take another route to the upper levels. Along the way, Audrey comes across a familiar and adorable face. She finds Bendy, playing with a toy train in the middle of the hallway. Audrey makes an attempt to say hello to the little Bendy, but unfortunately, she forgot about her new backhand of death powers she got earlier, and almost kills the little guy by accident. Bendy runs away, understandably frightened, and Audrey chases after him. Sadly, she loses him almost instantly. Audrey is unable to find the little Bendy, but she comes across an open room with blank easels, all lined up next to a locked door. The door has the words, "No visitors, go away, and don't knock," written all over it. So naturally, the first thing she does is knock on the door. The lost one on the other side of the door refuses to open it unless we find his missing drawings and return them to the nearby easels. So, with nothing else to do, Audrey ventures further. Surely there won't be anything dangerous about retrieving a lost drawing. Oh, so this new intimidating voice belongs to no other than the Ink Demon himself. So, Wilson kind of made it up when he claimed that he killed the Ink Demon. And now the Ink Demon is just waltzing around taunting Audrey. It should be okay though. We should be fine. It's not like he's just gonna show up behind— Oh fuck, he's right there! We start out the second chapter by searching the maze of rooms and vents, while we look around for the missing drawings. The whole time, we have to keep an eye out for any sign of the Ink Demon's presence, and hide when we hear him approaching. Audrey is fortunate enough to avoid the Ink Demon, but he promises that he will find her eventually.
You cannot hide forever. I will find you.
Anyway, Audrey returns to the locked door and places the drawings on the easels outside. And the Lost One was so grateful for Audrey's kindness that he invites her in and pours her a nice cup of coffee. He just immediately runs out and tries to kill her. for some reason. More time passes, Audrey solves more puzzles, and eventually she finds a locked box, with a dead lost one lying nearby. The lost one has left an audio log with a recording of their promise to bring a new character of theirs to life. That new character being a ghost girl named Carly. Now, this is where Audrey has a choice. Does she open the box, or does she leave it closed? Because if Audrey opens the box, she releases the ghost. And then, the ghost is free to show up wherever she wants, whenever she wants, scaring the living shit out of the poor woman, and it's all your fault if you decide to open the fucking box! In this current timeline, Audrey decides to not open the box, the correct decision, and continues on her way. Audrey eventually comes across yet another drop into the abyss, but she also finds another lost one across said death drop. This lost one appears to be much more friendly and wears a fancy pair of goggles. The man is called Porter. Audrey crosses the death drop using a massive pipe and follows Porter further down the halls until Porter gets stuck in an ink-clogged pipe. Audrey is able to help Porter out of the ink-clogged pipe, leading to a rather comical outcome. After helping Porter, the new friend passes on another ability to Audrey called Flow. With this newfound ability, Audrey is able to swiftly dash forward a short distance. So basically just think of Tracer's Blink from Overwatch. This ability comes in handy for Audrey, along with multiple upgrades that can be made to the gent pipe, as Audrey is now able to search the studio for the elevators much more easily, but not without the Ink Demon constantly hunting and taunting her in the process.
Your journey will end as you are consumed into my dark kingdom. Here, you will find meaning in your pain.
Audrey finally reaches the elevators, but is stopped when she stumbles upon the Ink Demon as he's consuming a dead lost one. Audrey is forced to hide and wait until the Ink Demon leaves the area. Once the coast is clear, Audrey is finally able to board the elevator and head to the upper levels. And already the ride was looking pretty sweet. She had banger elevator music, and she had the elevator all to herself, if you discount the dead lost one on the floor. The vibes were immaculate. Nothing could go wrong here. Well, shit. Without warning, Audrey is suddenly dropped into a nest swarming with a crap ton of fuck no, and is forced to go absolutely ballistic on everything. After a quick boss fight, Audrey is eventually able to kill a massive creepy crawler from hell, and will most definitely be left with severe arachnophobia after this. After killing the King Widow, Audrey continues further into the studio. Unfortunately, due to the elevator apparently being off limits, Audrey is forced to go further down instead of up. Along the way, Audrey crosses paths with a familiar face.
I believe there's something special in all of us. Especially you, Audrey.
Who are you?
Don't you know me? Take a good look.
That is Joey Drew, the former CEO of Joey Drew Studios before it closed down. Joey invites Audrey into his hideout while he gives her some more of his impeccable wisdom.
It's a cycle, Audrey. An ink-stained nightmare, forever stuck on repeat. With just a pencil and a dream, and with a little help from the Gent Corporation, it came into being. The truth is, Audrey, someone out there is messing with what's in here. Bad things have begun to emerge from the puddles. The worst ones call themselves keepers. Dangerous, deadly folks. They've taken over the old Gent workshop just beyond the sewers, freezing the cycle in place, changing the script.
He gives her advice on where she should head next in order to find answers to the questions she currently has. The time eventually comes for Audrey to leave, but before she does, Joey gives her some parting words.
You're here for a reason, Audrey. There's always a reason, even when you can't understand it.
You made this world. Why can't you fix it?
Because I'm not the man. I'm just the memory.
Yep, Joey is dead. In fact, the death inscribed onto the headstone indicates that he died no more than 2 years prior to the events of the game. Moving on, Audrey is eventually able to find a system of sewers. She briefly has to perform some casual maintenance on the sewer tunnels before she can continue. That's nothing too difficult for Audrey though. Just some button pushing, some girl bossing, and some good old-fashioned soul consuming. And the whole time, she passes a bunch of propaganda for some random dude called Lord Amok, whoever the fuck that is. Oh, it's that guy. So anyway, a massive and totally majestic battle ensues as Amok unleashes his guards onto Audrey. After quickly killing the guards, Amok himself steps up to fight. The whole thing lasts literally no more than 30 seconds.
And now Audrey is the new Amok! All hail the Queen!
So now, Audrey is able to leave her newly obtained domain and continue on. Climbing up a ladder, she quickly finds an old rundown waiting room with a massive window looking over a ruined, almost apocalyptic city. This sepia-toned world isn't limited to the old studio anymore. In fact, it's debatable if it even had those limitations in the first place. Oh, and he's here too! Hey, little buddy! Audrey apologizes to the little demon for accidentally hurting him earlier. She proposes a friendship between them, to which Bendy seems to agree. Audrey and Bendy agree to search for the old Gent building, under the promise that Audrey will ensure Bendy's safety. With that, Audrey and Bendy begin looking through the streets of the city, quickly finding the main entrance to the Gent building. Unfortunately, the gate is locked, and an ID card is required to even get into the building. Audrey and Bendy look through multiple trash bins and mailboxes, and eventually find a note to sell for one of the Gent employees, reminding themselves that their ID card is in their room at a nearby hotel. When they eventually find the hotel, Bendy decides to wait in the lobby while Audrey searches through the different rooms for the ID card. It's not long before Audrey finds the Gent employee's room with their ID card just on the nightstand. Audrey reaches down to collect the ID card before she gets an unexpected visit.
How goes the journey?
Slow, but I'll get through.
Ah, I see you have your father's never-quit go-getter spirit.
Oh, now you knew my father. Well, newsflash, I didn't even know my father.
I see then. You've chosen to forget the past. There's something I want to show you.
Wait, what are you doing?
Joey then casually teleports Audrey to the studio lobby. It's all run down, messy, and decaying. Some of the walls and ceilings have even caved in. Joey has Audrey sit down while he turns on a projector, basically giving her a PowerPoint presentation in which he gives her his explanation for the studio's history. This world was created by Joey, motivated by the bitterness and petty hatred toward his former business partner Henry Stein. In Joey's explanation, he claims to have authored a story in which he would torture his own version of Henry, forcing Henry to endure a demented and hellish adaptation of the aftermath of the studio's downfall. But as the years passed, a woman named Allison Pendle befriended Joey, bringing a long-forgotten sense of joy and light into Joey's life. Shortly after, Joey decided to create one last thing before his passing.
Something he had always wanted, but he could never have. A family. And after many, many tries, he created something that made him happier than he ever could have imagined. A wonderful, loving daughter. Bright, kind, almost human.
Audrey is not human. She never was. She was created from the ink machine and raised by Joey as though she were his own child. It's pretty safe to assume that this made Audrey pretty upset. I mean, I can't really blame her. I'd feel the same way too if my dad randomly told me that I was made of ink. Shocked, confused, and angry, Audrey angrily yells at Joey, making him take her back to the hotel so she can continue on her journey. Once she's back at the hotel, Audrey grabs the ID card, wiping tears from her eyes as she returns to the Gent building. But before she can enter the Gent building, the ink demon jumps down in front of her, blocking her path. His attack is fortunately cut short when 2 nearby signal towers turn on, emitting colorful flashes of light. The signal from the towers immediately begin to affect Audrey. as she nearly collapses from the pain and discomfort caused by the towers. But it's not just Audrey being affected by the towers. The ink demon is being affected as well. He lays down on the ground, curling up into the fetal position and quickly shrinking down into the smaller, cartoonish version of Bendy that was accompanying Audrey earlier. Before Audrey is able to say or do anything, the little Bendy slips away through a gap in the walls, where Audrey is unable to follow. Audrey enters the gem building and is quickly stopped by the building's residents, known as the Keepers. Throughout the conversation, more like interrogation, Audrey tries to convince them to help her find Wilson, while the Keepers relentlessly refer to her as a dangerous subject. Audrey continues to plead with them to take her to Wilson before they eventually decide she's too dangerous to be kept alive. They immediately trap her in the room and begin filling it with gas to kill her. Audrey is able to escape the room by breaking into one of the vents. She travels through the gem building, sneaking past Keepers and playing a brief game of hide-and-seek with a lost one called Heidi. Audrey eventually stumbles into the Gent Workshop prison, where she finds a tired-looking man named Henry Stein, the same Henry that Joey was talking about back in the old studio. Henry shares what he knows about the current situation to Audrey. Wilson has captured almost everyone involved in the main plot of the cycle and locked them in the Gent Workshop prison, where he can ensure they are unable to keep the cycle in motion. The prisoners have been labeled as cycle breakers, which is kind of ironic because the only one actually breaking any cycle here is Wilson. But that's not what's important right now. What is important is that there is a special reel of film labeled with the words "The End," and the Keepers have it locked away in the pit. Audrey then plans on finding the reel and using it to reset the cycle, in hopes of making things a little bit more bearable for everyone trapped inside it. Henry's parting words to Audrey are a promise that he will be waiting in the prison if she ever needs to return for assistance, as if he'll actually be going anywhere anytime soon. With that, Audrey enters the pit, or at least she tries to, before she's immediately caught and captured by a keeper that was alerted to unauthorized personnel attempting to enter it. By the way, this needs to be said. Audrey, I love you. I adore you even. But you made zero effort to do anything in this situation. Nothing. No throwing of hands. You didn't even try to hide. Like, what the fuck? Chapter 5 begins with Audrey doing what any BATIM protagonist would do in a scenario like this. Waking up, she finds herself on board a subway train with Wilson as her fellow passenger. He urges Audrey to rest, as she's still weak from whatever violent shit she endured from the previous interaction with that one keeper she probably thought was blind, because she made no effort to hide. Audrey immediately buries Wilson in a pile of questions. Those questions being along the lines of, "What the fuck, Wilson? Why am I here? Why do I look like I was bathed in radioactive coffee? Who hurt you?" To which Wilson returns the exchange of confusion with his own ramblings. How this world is basically a horror story with a sketchbook filter, with the two of them being isekai'd into it with special powers and the privilege of being the chosen one. Oh no, wait, that's just Audrey. Wilson goes further about the potential and life that the ink in this world possesses. Anything created in this world with the ink could somehow be released into the real world. But first, they had to ensure that it would be safe to do so by domesticating it in some way. He finishes off the monologue by asking the following question.
Are they really life? Or are they just stains? Old mistakes ready to be cleansed away for newer, greater things.
When she's finally able to get a word in, Audrey asks Wilson what he wants with her. To answer this, Wilson claims that he needs her help in saving his father's life. Which, I gotta stop this again. Audrey, look at him. This crusty, dusty, old-ass man. I want you to tell me what about this man implies a father that is not dead. Literally, I don't see how Audrey didn't question his claim here. He looks old enough to be her grandfather, for fuck's sake. Anyway, the train comes to a stop, and Audrey follows Wilson through a security scan. This isn't before the ink demon reaches out to her, however, most likely telepathically, and trying to warn her that Wilson is lying.
Be Quiet.
What did you say?
Nothing. It was nothing.
Once Audrey is through the security check, Wilson comments on the signal towers that are peppered all over the place. He explains that the towers are used to repel the Ink Demon as they weaken him and nullify his powers. He remarks on the Gent Corporation's involvement in the construction of the towers, and how it implies that Gent has had their own experiences in handling the Ink Demon. We finally arrive at the destination, a fancy mansion, likely Wilson's current place of residence. Audrey eventually asks Wilson if he even killed the Ink Demon in the first place, like the propaganda posters were claiming. Wilson surprisingly admits to lying about the whole thing. He states that the Ink Demon is just too powerful for him to destroy. Wilson explains that in order to keep the Ink Demon under control, they had him sealed away in the smaller, cartoonish form that Audrey encountered multiple times prior. Now, he doesn't explicitly state how this was done, but there are 3 audio logs left by the Keepers in the Gent laboratory that explain how the Keepers were unable to dispose of the Ink Demon even after countless hours of torture. Instead of killing him, the Keepers resorted to trapping him in the small form of Bendy, using multiple lengths of steel wire to cut into the side of his body. Wilson remarks on it being a fitting prison for the Ink Demon, before pondering how the Ink Demon was even able to free himself from it in the first place. During this scene, we are also introduced to a woman named Betty. She's Wilson's housekeeper, among other things. What other things, Wilson? That's not a good thing to have no clarification on. Anyway, Audrey is instructed to follow Betty to her room, where she can get some very well-deserved rest before Wilson departs from them to his laboratory. On the way to her room, Betty makes sure to warn Audrey against venturing into the North Wing, due to it being overrun by Keepers. Audrey eventually finds her room, and has a brief conversation with Betty, eventually asking if she trusts Wilson. Betty confesses that she doesn't really trust anybody in this world, but stays with Wilson because he keeps her safe. She also remarks on him saying that she reminds him of his mother, though she doesn't seem to understand what a mother is. She asks Audrey if mothers are a good thing where they're from, to where Audrey admits to being unsure about it herself. Betty quickly ends the conversation by instructing Audrey to drink a special beverage meant to help her sleep before she heads off to bed. With that, Betty closes the door, leaving Audrey alone in her room. Okay, this time I promise I'm not gonna fucking rant about it again. I'll save it for later, but still, I don't believe that anyone with common sense would actually do this after everything. Anyway, moving on. So Audrey mixes up the drink, after nearly killing Wilson's pet fish in the process, and in spite of every single red flag that she's seen, she drinks it. Surely nothing bad will happen after Audrey falls for the very obviously devious ploy against her. Oh, okay, that's not what I was expecting. But my point still stands. Also, white woman jump scare. When Audrey eventually wakes up, she looks around and finds herself being held in a run-down library with a nice dinner party set up in the middle. Seated across the table from her is a disturbing yet undeniably classy woman. The woman in the fancy chair is Alice Angel, known throughout the studio for her cruel and demented methods of killing any poor soul who is unfortunate enough to cross her. Alice fully intends on subjecting Audrey to similar things, if not worse, but first, she wants to wear the lady down by torturing her with games. Audrey will have to talk with the other party guests and solve a riddle. If she guesses correctly, Alice promises to let her leave. But if she guesses wrong... Naturally, Audrey passes with flying colors, and everyone claps. Alice gets pissed off that Audrey got it right, and the lights go out. When the lights come back on, Alice is nowhere to be seen, and the other guests are probably very dead right now. Audrey explores the library some more and quickly finds her gent pipe. Alice must have brought it here for Audrey to find later. How kind of her. Holy shit! Audrey begins making her way out of the new area before she's cut off by Alice Angel, who is now armed with a Tommy gun. With no other alternative in sight, Audrey is forced to open up some gates and sneak up behind Alice in an attempt to banish her. Alice hears Audrey sneaking up on her, and the two girls have a brief back and forth struggle, by which I mean it lasts like 5 seconds, and they both end up falling for each other. Literally. Alice ends up standing over Audrey, aiming the Tommy gun right at her. For a moment, it actually seems like Audrey is about to die here before... The more violent Alice dies in the arms of the friendly one. In the following moment that is a brief reunion, Audrey and Alice decide to change Alice's name to Allison, likely due to Audrey remembering Joey's story about the woman who befriended him. Their reunion is then interrupted when Allison is suddenly all like, "Wait a damn minute, this is Wilson's home, why the fuck are you here?" The two somewhat bicker about whether or not Wilson is the slightest bit trustworthy. Audrey is able to convince Allison to let her see Wilson again to hear him out on his plan to defeat the Ink Demon. Allison makes plans to go and search for anyone who is able and willing to assist them on their upcoming battle before the two depart, wishing each other good luck on their respective tasks. Audrey continues her journey back to Wilson, eventually coming to the realization that Alice took her to the North Wing, the one place that Betty warned her not to go. Fortunately, Audrey is able to sneak past the keepers using a music box. Audrey eventually returns to the main lobby of the mansion, meeting up with Betty. Although Betty seems completely unbothered by the fact that Audrey came from the North Wing, especially since Audrey was last seen heading to her room before Alice kidnapped her. Very suspicious if you ask me. But anyway, Betty points Audrey towards Wilson's laboratory, saying that he's waiting there for her. Audrey makes her way down the stairs to the laboratory, getting a pretty concerning sight of colored ink being plastered all over the place along the way. Wilson quickly invites her into the lab, giving her a detailed explanation of his plan. Rather than attempting to kill the Ink Demon, Wilson has been setting up a special weapon, a challenger, who will fight the Ink Demon and dethrone him. The new deity will then take the Ink Demon's place as the ruler of the sepia-toned world. Wilson then introduces Audrey to his creation, a cartoonish sailor named Ship-Ahoy Dudley. It's basically an OC. Audrey questions Wilson's plans on maintaining control of the new deity, to which Wilson gives a rather simple explanation.
All the factors must be perfect. The right design, the right science, and the right soul.
What?
Yep. That's the reason why Wilson dragged her into this world. His plan was to bring her here and use her soul, her own being, to ensure the perfection of his creation. Wilson goes on to admit to lying about wanting to save his father, additionally revealing his name.
Nathan Arch, owner of Archgate, industrial genius, business tycoon.
Wilson proceeds to go on a monologue about how he's been unable to come to terms with his inability to achieve greatness of any kind in the eyes of his father. He even drags Audrey into the mix, claiming that with her help, he can finally achieve something to be proud of. Audrey finally has an understandable reaction to all Wilson's bullshit and is all like, "Fuck no, I don't want to roleplay as your OC." And then Wilson's all like, "Nah, come on, you'll love it, you'll basically be God himself." And then Audrey's like, "Bitch, did I stutter?" And then she pushes him into the machine where he's basically just shredded into a million pieces. He'll be fine. Audrey explores further into Wilson's lab, eventually finding this big, open room with the ink machine chained up at the far end of it. As Audrey approaches the machine, the Ink Demon can be heard talking to her again.
You were birthed from the darkest shadows. It's time to ask the question.
Audrey pulls the lever that pops up in the center of the room, immediately turning on the machine, and creating one of the coolest designs I've ever seen for a BATIM character. Unfortunately, said design is also a fucked up failure of the character who was supposed to be Ship-Ahoy Dudley. The boy and the crab that were sharing the spotlight in the drawing were now merged into one, and little pieces of Wilson's body could be seen reaching out from Dudley's abdomen. Audrey is forced to fight the failed creation, shocking it with the signal towers and hitting it with the gent pipe wherever she can. Once the giant crab man is weak enough, she gives Wilson the bitch slap of no return and looks up at the newborn creature. Why she makes no attempt to run away, I have no idea. All I can really guess is that maybe she thought he'd be friendly once Wilson was gone. Spoiler alert, he's not. In fact, to show his lack of friendliness, Dudley just snatches Audrey off the floor and just rips off her fucking legs. But before Dudley can kill her, the ink demon breaks into the room and attacks him. Within moments, the ink demon kills Dudley with a single bite to the neck. The last thing we see is the ink demon dragging Dudley's body into the basin below the ink machine, before Audrey passes out from shock. Audrey eventually wakes up in a puddle made up of her blood. Wait a minute, is it blood or is it ink? You know what, either way it's an essential body fluid that's quickly leaking out of her, so, either way it's a bad thing. Audrey looks up to see the ink demon approaching her slowly. She tries to crawl away, but he quickly catches up to her, kneeling over her as he begins to berate her. He tells her that there's nowhere else that she can go. He urges her to join him in the dark puddles, claiming that she has no more meaning to her life otherwise.
You're a mistake. Like me. But I will make you strong. I will make you meaningful.
With that, he extends his hand toward her. We can see Audrey's shaking hand reaching out to it. Not that I can really blame her, though. I mean, it's either that or slowly bleed out on the floor. Right after accepting his offer, Audrey is consumed by the ink demon, and merges with him into a larger, more monstrous form. Audrey seems to regret taking this offer almost immediately, looking down at their hand and asking herself, "What's happening?" Suddenly, a familiar voice is heard from right in front of them. The newly formed figure looks up and finds Joey's memory, standing there and holding the end wheel. He speaks out to Audrey. He reminds her that in spite of her inhuman nature, Joey still loved and cherished every moment he had with her. He loved her as though she were his own daughter, because to him, she was his daughter, his greatest creation, and he assures her that she still has a choice to believe whatever it is she wishes to believe. The ink demon approaches Joey, quickly grabbing him and crushing him in his hand, and claiming that the failure of Joey Drew will die right here in this moment. With his last few breaths, Joey says one last thing.
It's never too late. Just a pencil and a dream. Isn't enough. You have to have heart.
And right in his last moment, Joey looks up at the large figure, and he gives the ink demon a very small, but very confident smile. Audrey looks down at the reel that Joey dropped. After a few moments, the ink demon notices her eyeing the reel. Without wasting another moment, Audrey takes the reel and steals full control over the monstrous form that she and the ink demon are sharing, bursting through the walls in search of a projector. Along the way, Audrey receives help from the many friends she made throughout her journey. Allison, Tom, Porter, and even a hulking searcher called Steve comes along to join the fight. Sammy spectates the fight for a few seconds, trying to convert the locals to the ink demon's cult before... Finally, Henry tags along, opening the last door and directing Audrey toward the projector. And with that, Audrey inserts the end reel and plays it. She even points the damn thing right into their eyes to make sure the ink demon gets a first-class view of it all. Audrey is then able to return to the real world, having gained new knowledge of herself and her father's cartoon world. She now has complete control over the cartoon world, and has plans to make day-to-day life more bearable for everyone trapped inside it. But she's not entirely alone as an Inkborn creature, as she decided to bring Bendy along as a companion back to the real world. The story then comes to a close, with the post-credit scene showing a truck from the Gent Corporation confiscating the ink machine, along with all the items used in the ritual to enter the cartoon world. Okay, with what I currently know about Audrey's story all covered, I'd like to begin going over everything that I liked about her, and the things that I feel could either be improved or done differently. In the spirit of ripping off the Band-Aid, let's go with the critiques first. For starters, my biggest issue with Audrey is that there are a few moments where she displays some pretty questionable gullibility. One instance that might come to mind is the elevator scene in the prologue. Wilson is a massive sign that says, "I will kill or harm you if you let me on the elevator." And in most cases, this type of scenario would result in the viewer yelling, "Don't let him on the elevator." But I'm counting this scene as an exception, because it displays a scenario that many people are all too familiar with. I won't delve into it too deeply, but to put it simply, Audrey is alone on this elevator, and some creepy guy is asking to join her on it. Even though several alarms are likely going off in Audrey's head, she doesn't know how Wilson will react if she doesn't let him on the elevator with her. So I'm not disappointed when she lets him join. Now, while that moment may have a bit of a free pass from me, there are a couple other moments that don't get the same luxury. For starters, we have the scene where Wilson claims that he wants to save his father's life. After everything he's put her through, I find it hard to believe that Audrey would be so quick to go along with Wilson's plans, let alone believe that Wilson's father is even still alive somehow. It just comes across to me as the writers of the story needing some way for Audrey to willingly follow Wilson to his home, and just decided to throw this into the mix. It would have been a little bit more believable if they at least made Audrey a little bit hesitant to trust Wilson on his claim. Another moment occurs about 5 minutes later, where Betty advises Audrey to drink a sedative beverage. If I were tricked into turning on a machine that transported me into a world where everything that lives and breathes is trying to kill other living and breathing things, I would be extremely hesitant to trust the man who brought me there in the first place. And I know that it's Betty that gives Audrey the recipe for the drink, but Betty works for Wilson, and Audrey has known her for about 3 minutes by this point. I feel like it would have been more believable if Audrey wasn't informed that the drink would put her to sleep, or if Alice simply knocked her unconscious instead. I mean, she already snuck into the room before Audrey even took the drink. They could have written it in a way where Audrey sneaks into her room and waits until she lets her guard down before sneaking up behind her and whacking her upside the head with a blunt object or something. Either way, it would have been more believable for me than it already is. Alright, I think those are good enough examples for my first point. I'm going to move on to the next one. My second point of criticism for Audrey's story comes in the form of the foreshadowing. While the twist of Audrey being Joey's daughter is a really cool concept, I feel like there's one part of it that could have been done a little more. For example, we know that there are a few things that hint toward this twist. We have the framed artwork from Henry that we see in Joey's apartment at the end of the first game, now hanging in Audrey's office in the prologue. We have a moment in the scene where Audrey is collecting the items for the pedestals in the prologue as well, where she grabs the Illusion of Living book and brushes her hand over it in an almost affectionate manner. It's almost as if a small part of her subconscious still remembers Joey. I'll move on to my point in a second here, but my favorite little bit of foreshadowing happens in the scene where Audrey breaks into Animation Alley. The scene where she nearly passes out walking through the partially flooded room, and begins to hear the voices of the ink talking to her. The barely audible sounds of the crying baby gives just a small little hint to how Audrey was born, and you don't even think about it until playing the game again later. But all the while, the cries are still there, letting you know that there's more to Audrey than what was shown at the start of the game. These are examples of the foreshadowing at its best, in my opinion. But I believe it somewhat falls short, or it's at least more noticeable, when we reach Chapter 4 of BATIM. When Joey meets up with Audrey in the hotel, he says,
"Ah, I see you have your father's never-quit go-getter spirit."
To which Audrey responds with,
Oh, now you knew my father. Well, newsflash, I didn't even know my father. Or my mother. Or anyone else in my family.
And it was in this moment right here where I realized something. This is the first time the story addresses Audrey not remembering her family. I've played this game at least 2 times by this point, and I can't find any other instance before this scene where this is brought up. And I will admit that this development did seem a tad out of nowhere for me when I first watched it. I feel like it would have helped if we learned about this sometime sooner in the game. Maybe we could have had a short scene in the prologue where Audrey interacts with her coworkers, or at least overhears them talking about their families, and the scene focuses on Audrey's reaction to the discussion. Maybe we could have had little bits where Audrey is sneaking around, and she overhears the lost ones crying and mourning as they talk about their families. They could be talking about how they miss their families, wondering if their families are still mourning or if they've already moved on. Maybe we could have had a little detail where the lost ones are struggling to even remember the names of their loved ones, or even what their loved ones looked like, and Audrey, overhearing this, could make a brief comment that reflects her being in a similar issue. It would have further benefited the twist of Joey being Audrey's father if we learned about her not remembering her father some time before her talk with Joey in Chapter 4. But even without these concepts, the twist is still done very well, and I really enjoy the story for the most part. Now, with the critiques over and done with, I'd like to finally begin going over everything that I absolutely love about Audrey. For starters, I'd like to go over Audrey's design. In the real world, Audrey appears to be your average pretty lady. She appears to be around or in her early 20s. She has fair skin, brown hair done up in a style that I'm told are victory rolls, and her eyes are either green, blue, or a mixture of both. I honestly don't know. I've been drawing her for over a year and I still can't tell. She wears black shoes, black pants, and a light blue sweater. And one thing that a friend pointed out to me is that her hairstyle is actually outdated. The game takes place in the early 70s, yet her hairstyle was supposedly popular more than a few decades prior. This was likely due to Joey not knowing what the fashion trends were at the time he created her, and decided to just go with what he was familiar with back in the day. Moving on to her cycle form, not much of her changes physically. The two things you'll notice first are the changes in the color palette to fit the cycle's sepia-toned nature, and the stains of ink that are drenched all over her body. When you look at the design for a little longer, you'll notice that her eyes glow in a bright yellow light. Finally, moving down her body, you can see that Audrey's hand has been somewhat deformed or mutated on her way into the cycle. It's larger than her other hand, with longer, more slender fingers. This hand is the same hand that later receives the sigils of the abilities that Audrey receives early on in the events of BATIM. The more exaggerated features of her left hand likely hint at her inkborn nature. I'd like to think that this represents what Audrey goes through in Chapter 4. For most of her life, she's probably had questions about herself that she never really took the time to explore. Such as, why can my fingers bend so far back? And then suddenly, there's this little part of her that gets uncovered, and it begins to bring answers to all of these other questions. This is definitely me reading into this too deep, but I can relate to this. No, I'm not an ink creature disguised as a human, but I am autistic. And for the vast majority of my life, I didn't know that I was autistic. I didn't even know what autism was. But once I got the diagnosis, I had a lot of realizations about myself. I still have them to this day. You can't tell me Audrey isn't going through the same thing here. In any way, I like to think of this story as one about self-discovery, delving into your past and your identity and your passions. And in the end, it's your choice what you do with your experiences. For my second topic on things I adore, I'd like to talk about her voice. Regardless of whether she's talking to a friend or just talking to herself, Audrey often speaks in a soft, calming tone. There's rarely an instance where the delivery of Audrey's voice lines sound off or annoying in any way. She is an absolute delight to listen to as I play the game, and the moments where Audrey is in pain are absolutely chilling. The scene where Alice has Audrey complete the puzzle are extremely stressful for me for this reason. I messed up the puzzle in one of my later playthroughs, and I had to watch as Audrey was nearly killed on the electric chair. That alone was a good motivator to triple check if I got the puzzle right. And even when I know that I got the right answer, I still have that sense of dread in the back of my head as I wait for Alice to pull the lever. Audrey is voiced by the amazingly skilled and talented Erin Lane. I was given the amazing opportunity to get to meet her, and she's one of the sweetest people I've ever met. Chatting with her has been such a delight, and I constantly look forward to each love stream that she hosts on her YouTube channel. Long story short, Erin Lane does an amazing job of voicing Audrey, and I can't wait to hear her again in future games. The third thing that I absolutely adore are the little moments where Audrey acts a little goofy, just a little bit silly. Even at the start of the game where Audrey says time for a little adventure, it just shows how bubbly and upbeat she can be when she's in a good mood. Even in the hidden, easy-to-miss moments in the game, Audrey can still take the time to whip out a little bit of sarcasm.
Okay, yeah, and that totally makes sense.
Seeing Audrey sneak in these little gestures just makes her feel a little more human. And there are a lot of moments in day-to-day life where people can't help cracking a little joke, and this detail does a great job at showing how Audrey goes about this habit. Also, she's really hot. Another detail that I like is how the game goes about showing the player who Audrey is as a character. Right at the start of the game, the Employee of the Month portrait in her office tells us that Audrey is a diligent and hardworking person, or is at least willing to do the work that is necessary to achieve her goal. This is further backed up in scenes like Heidi's game, and the moment that Audrey finds the gent pipe. When it becomes clear that Audrey has some work that needs to be done, and the work will potentially put her progress to a temporary halt, she's still willing to get it done, and there's little to no hint of annoyance or dread about having to put in extra effort. It just goes to show how patient she can be when she needs to. As mentioned earlier, the little moments we see where Audrey talks to herself or makes silly little gestures tells the player that Audrey isn't opposed to making the moment lighthearted when she gets the chance. She values finding the little things that she finds along her way that can bring even a little bit of joy to the moment. Even in moments where Audrey is talking to herself, she often does so in a soft, uplifting, and even comforting tone. If she can, Audrey will often make an attempt to lighten the mood for herself and those she cares about. The final thing I would like to talk about is Audrey's Inkborn origin. Because Audrey was created using the ink machine, the stakes in the story can be even higher. When Audrey wakes up in the cycle in Chapter 1, we can find a note addressed to Grant Cohen, and it reads, "To Grant Cohen, accounting. Please inform Mr. Drew that despite his insistence that the rumors of Joey Drew Studios going bankrupt are untrue, I want to remind him that if his studio does indeed fail, all equipment and experiments produced through our partnership by contract belong to the Gent Corporation. We will reclaim these assets forcibly if necessary. Alan Gray." And in the post-credits cutscene at the end of the game, we can see the ink machine, along with the ritual items, loaded into a truck belonging to the Gent Corporation. We already know that Gent are very keen on following through with their ultimatum. That begs a few questions from me. What will happen to Audrey if Gent discovers what she is? Will they leave her alone, or will they try to take her too? And probably the most chilling question so far, do they already know? Anything that could happen with the ink machine and the realm inside it could greatly impact Audrey on a very personal level. It could even pose a risk to her own life. The possibilities of what can be explored when it comes to Audrey and her connection to the machine are plenty, and I am so excited to see what the developers do with it in future games. And a part of me is even hoping that we could get the slightest bit of Audrey content in The Cage when it comes out. But I understand that The Cage is supposed to focus on Henry and the other prisoners that are being held in the pit at the time. So I get it if we don't really get anything revolving around her for this one. But even if we get a brief scene where Henry gets a glimpse of her, I'll be happy. Sure, we get to play as her for the entirety of BATIM, but it's all in first person, with the exception of the opening cutscene in the prologue. The most we actually see of her is in a mirror. Let me see her face! Audrey has a lot of potential in BATIM's universe. She could bring some context to what's happening outside of the sepia-toned realm now that we know she has at least some way of traversing between them. And the fact that she is an ink-born creature with the appearance of a human allows the narrative to further explore how she balances her humanity with the undeniable connection she has to the machine. And with Gent now making conscious efforts to reclaim everything that was made under their contract with Joey Drew Studios, the ways we can further explore her beliefs and values are even more numerous. I'm not sure what the developers have planned after The Cage is released, but I really hope that Audrey gets to be part of it. If you've reached this point in the video, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this. I spent an ungodly amount of time working on this video. As I'm writing this conclusion, it's already approaching 9,000 words. But anyways, I appreciate you listening to my info dump. If you want to keep up with the content that I make, be sure to subscribe or follow me on Twitter, as that's usually where I'm the most active. But for now, thank you for watching, hail Queen Amok, and I hope you have a fabulous day.